Hi, I'm Lee Momalan, and in this video we're going to look at Ableton Live's Scale MIDI device. So, as you might already guess, Scale MIDI device is about using musical scales or modes. So, choice of what notes we're going to allow ourselves to use for our musical compositions. And it's called a MIDI device because it isn't transposing and repitching audio, it's using the raw musical data that then feeds into an instrument. So we can't use this on an audio track, it's for MIDI instrument tracks. So I've got an operator device here. I'm going to grab scale and drop it onto the track. So you'll notice its position is before the instrument because it is a MIDI processor. Now, scale does come with a lot of options in terms of preset of scales and modes that we can choose, but I want to just kind of go through the main function of scale first before we explore that. So I'm going to just input a C note that can just go on in the background whilst I play around with scale in the other view. So we'll just have this a bit quieter. So what we have here is a range of semitone intervals, so the chromatic intervals of a keyboard here. So the neighboring notes, white and black. And we're currently triggering a C. And the current anchoring position of the scale device is set to be at the very bottom left corner, C, because the bass setting is at C. You'll notice the actual position of the the equivalent of the white and black notes changes if we change this bass. So I know I'm going to use a C in my MIDI editor, and if I was to create a melody and then use a scale or a mode after that point, I'm classing C as the key of the music that I'm working with. So it's important that the scale device is anchored around that root note of the actual scale or mode. So at the moment, when I'm playing a C, it's outputting a C. But for that note, that C note, if I want to change the note that it outputs, I can highlight a different block. Or if I don't actually want it to play a note and I want it to be muted and not be used as part of my setup, I can just disable the block and have it play no notes at all. So it won't let notes through for that particular note. So let me just show you that in practice. Okay, so we've got all of our 12 possible notes to the next octave there. And at the moment, it's like for like. For the note that's going in, the note that we expect to come out will come out. So at the moment, it's almost as if scale is turned off. It's not doing anything at this particular time. So the next thing we want to play with is how we can alter those notes. So one way we can do that is to put in a preset. So if we just go for the first of what we call the modes, which is a use of the same separation of notes, the distance or the intervals between the notes, except there's a certain run and order of those notes, but we choose a different position to start off on, and it's like a wheel that goes round, and we start halfway through and jump back to the beginning and jump back to that middle point. So the choice of mode have various different names, and they're then used as what we call scales, which is like a choice of intervals and given notes. But the presets that we load in will be based around these different intervals that we want to play with in our melodic content. So I'm going to load in the C major preset here. And you'll notice that immediately some of these notes have been highlighted, but they're different than the diagonal line. So we've now distorted that relationship of MIDI notes going in and MIDI notes coming out of the device. So if I just do a chromatic run of notes, chromatic meaning those semitone runs up, so every single key going up to the next octave. So I'm going to go from that C note, go up one, so I'm using the arrow key here, duplicate, up one, duplicate, up one, duplicate, 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 duplicate. I'm just going to go up until I see that the note is the next octave of a C, so there's a C4 there. So Apple and A to highlight them all, press Command and L. So now if I play that with the scale device turned off, and then play it with the scale device turned on, you you notice that it's actually changed which notes are available and which notes are no longer available. So what's actually happening is it's the equivalent of only, because it's the C major, which is what we call the first mode of available intervals, it's only allowing it to play all the white notes when we're working from a C as our starting point. So it's the equivalent of just all those notes together, except Scale is already predetermining that those are the only ones we're allowed to use. So if I load in a different preset with that chromatic run of notes again, you'll hear how the relationship of the distance between the notes and what's allowed to be played changes. Okay, so far we've explored some presets and we understand that the Scale is basically predetermining the actual scale or mode selection of notes that we're allowed to use to create our melodies. So now I'm going to bring it into context of playing it in with some other musical instruments that are already established within my Ableton Live set. So let's just have a quick listen to the track. Okay, so let's say I want to use this Dorian mode preset. I like the way that that combination of note intervals, so there's space in between the notes I'm allowed to play, I like the way it sounds. But at the moment, it's assuming that I'm working in the musical key of C. Instead, I need to first find out what key I'm actually in for this project. So the easiest way to do this is actually to create a new clip. I need to find the most compatible note that will run through with the current song that's playing, and then that will be my root of my scale or mode that I'm trying to choose. So let me just load this clip in. I'm going to put in a single note that's long in duration, and then you have a choice of 12 notes basically, or 11 before you get to the next octave. So you have a choice of all the notes that are available and you just slowly narrow down which one's the most available. And then we're going to base our scale device around that note as the root of the mode that we've chosen, the Dorian mode in this case. Okay, so that was me moving from C3 to C4, so I've been through all the available notes. It seems like E was the most compatible. So bearing that in mind, if I just go back to the notes that I'm going to work with and allow Scale to modify, I'm going to anchor that first position of this chromatic run up to E. So I'm using the up and down arrows again here. Let's just turn the MIDI editor off there so we don't hear all the movements. So if I go back to the Scale device for a minute, turn it on, as long as this is also set to be anchored around that E position, it will now allow me to play in the key of E, but use the Dorian mode. So now if I press play, okay, so that's one method of making sure that the Scale device is in unison with the key of the other parts within a project. Another approach would be, if I go back a few steps, so this being back at C, would be to remain with all these notes being anchored and starting in this chromatic run upwards from the C note. So it sounds off, it's not the same key as the track, but instead use the transpose control. And we raise that enough semitones so it ends up being that the whole environment shifts it up to that E. So what's happening is I haven't changed the MIDI data I'm sticking in. It's still based around the base setting of Scale, which is at C. And instead, once it's generated the compatible notes for this given mode that I've loaded in, it's then transposing it up, up in this case, to be in the right key as the rest of the track. So let's move that transpose up until we get to that E. So 4 semitones up, so 1, 2, 3, 4, from the C to the E. So that's 2 methods to get this set up in the correct way that it will behave the way we expect it to. The key problem with this newer version over the old version is we're technically using notes on the grid that are based around a different key. So from a visual point of view, it might not make sense, but it is a method that works because once we've made sure that the scale device is modifying the key correctly and bringing it up to the correct key, the output is the same regardless. It's just two different workflows of how we can work with the scale device. So in this case, now that I'm set up, I'm going to just go for my preferred method, which is actually having the notes anchored around the correct position. Set that back to 0, set that up to E. We can now experiment with the notes that are available and try and create a new melody line. I know that all the notes from E upwards, or if I base kind of the melody that I've got has a good emphasis on that E note, any other note's going to be compatible in the Dorian mode that I'm working with. So let's put the editor on this time so I can audition the available note. So let's try that out. Let's just make that a 2-bar MIDI clip. Okay, so that's interesting. It's got an interesting feel to it. Now, what we can also do with the scale device is limit the range of notes it will listen and modify. So think of it as splitting the keyboard that we have here. We can choose that this scale device is going to allow the notes to be modified from this E to just below this E, and then we let the next run of notes go from this E to the next run of notes for the next scale that we might use, or mode. So I'm going to actually go to scale and set it, this instance. What E are we on here? Let's just double check. E3. So this one's set to E3. If you remember what I said, I'm going to go from this E to just below the E3. So not 12 notes, 11 notes. So I'm going to set the range to 11. So now this device is listening between the E3 and the D sharp just below it, or E flat, and it's going to only interpret those notes. The rest are going to be left unmodified. The reason why I'm doing this is it allows me to set up more than one scale or mode. So I can have part of my keyboard that gives me access to one of these scales, and then I can have another part that gives me access to another section as well, or another mode or scale. So this is starting from E, starting from E3, and the range is just one semitone below being at the next octave. So if we now bring in another, if we just turn that off for a minute so I can audition some other options. So let's try this option here. Just set it to E as well. And see if this sounds any different. So I've got a different flavor of melody to put in this track. I like the intervals of that new option apart from one of those notes. So I'm just thinking further down the line when I use it, I'll avoid that note in this particular instance for the rhythm and the choice of intervals that I've gone for. But that is an interesting option. So I'm going to set up this augmented scale to be available at the next E above the original Dorian. So let's set this one to E4. In fact, I've forgotten to set that to E just then, actually. So let's just see what that sounds like with the range down again. That sounds pretty much the same. So let's just put that up to the E4 for a minute. And then we can limit its range if we want, if we're going to do another mode or scale further up the keyboard. So just as a practice, let's just put that in as 11 semitones as well. And now what we have is Dorian on E3 up to just below the next E, which is the E4, and then we have the augmented scale happening at E4 upwards until the next E, and we haven't chosen anything else above that. So currently, if we play above that, we'll have the range of all the notes. It's not modified, so it'll be a normal chromatic range of notes. So that one's set up now, and what it basically means is if I take this pattern and let's just double the length of the loop. We'll take the second copy of notes and run it up to that E4 upwards. This now means we should be able to see this on the scale device, which one is and which one isn't engaged for each portion of that longer idea now. So now we're using two different scales and modes across the keyboard. So it's like a key splitting situation. The fold button can be used if you don't want the scales to have a large range of octaves. So if you put in a higher octave and you want it to fold the octave down to the other notes you might be using, it could be engaged and it will basically bring the two different octave options together. So it's a good way of trying to stop the range of notes getting too far away from each other. So once we've done our exercise with scales and modes, we want to play around with the nature of what's going on, we might want to move out of using this interpretive tool. So it's important to understand how we can capture these processes as a new MIDI clip. So in order to do that, I can go to Insert MIDI Clip, name it as New Idea, and basically make it listen to this track. So I'll call this Scale just so it makes more sense from the menu. So MIDI from Scale. We can choose if it's pre or post effects. We don't want to record what the clip's doing here. We want to record what the scale effects are doing. So we want to do it post effects. And then record arm, hit record, and it will capture those notes to a new track. Okay, so I've recorded it twice as long as the actual phrase went, but we recorded the clip in there. And if I want to just use the original instrument, I can either drag this to the original track and then remove my temporary tools, which was the scale devices, or I can grab the instrument and drag that onto the new MIDI track and remove the previous tracks and what their job was in my work. So now it's exactly the same as it was sonically, and the new MIDI clip contains those new modified intervals of notes. Right, so now we've used scale to interpret the notes that we're allowed to have access to. Let's have a look at one final way of interacting with this device. So I have a melody now. I could choose to modify it in the MIDI editor and make some changes to it. In this case, I might shift those higher scales that I had used to be in the same register, so the same octave range as the original Dorian work that I did. But aside from that, let's actually use scale as a way of interpreting the notes in a bit more of an explorative way. So if I bring in a initialize scale, so remember it's not currently doing anything to the range of notes, it's letting them out just as they should go in. Let's anchor ourselves in E again, because we know that's the key we're working in. And this time, when you look through and see the notes, if you remember what we were doing when we enabled and disabled blocks and so on, we can interpret per note that goes in what its output is. And this is an interesting way of, again, reinterpreting the data of what we're doing. So I'm going to go there, I'm going to let it play around and then just modify some of the notes and see what happens in terms of the output. Okay, so I'm playing around with some of those notes and seeing whether they're nice in this context, if they're sharpened slightly, so raised by pitch, or whether they're flattened, which is brought down by pitch as well. So at any point, you can either do that and then capture it again as a MIDI track, or you could have another MIDI track running at all points while you're experimenting and just record it as you go and then edit the MIDI data afterwards as well. So what we've done in this video is we've had a look at Ableton Live's Scale device and how the presets can be set up correctly to work in the current key that you're using within your actual project, how we can use it to have different scales and modes across the key range, and then finally, how we can use it to interpret any existing melodies that we might have within our project in a different way than dealing with notes on the MIDI editor, and instead using the Scale device and the input and output change, and how we can raise and flatten different pitches to come up with new ideas.